The stone was dry. That's the first thing I noticed. 3 days after a major storm had ripped through the Dordogne Valley in southwestern France, turned rivers into walls, swallowed roads, collapsed a railway bridge 4 kilometers upstream, the stone on the Pont Valentin was dry. Not just standing. Dry. Like the water had parted around it. Like it hadn't even been invited to the disaster. I had been traveling for 8 months at that point. Not as a tourist. I'd given up being a tourist somewhere around month 3. By then I was something else. A collector of contradictions. A person who stands in front of very old things and asks very uncomfortable questions. And standing there, staring at a bridge that had been built in 1308, watching the Lot River settle back into its banks below me, I had one of those moments where the world stops making sense in a way that never fully recovers. Because the bridge shouldn't be dry. Nothing should be dry after what had come through that valley. The modern road bridge 300 meters east, the one with steel reinforcements, engineered foundations, constructed using equipment that would have seemed like magic to the 14th century, had been damaged so badly they'd closed it. But the Pont Valentin, 700 years old, Gothic arches, hand-cut stone, allegedly built by craftsmen who didn't have a single formula to their name. Completely fine. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that a local woman walking her dog stopped and looked at me the way people look at someone who has been standing too still for too long. She said something in French. I don't speak much French. But I understood the gist. She was saying the bridge always survives. That's just what it does. She shrugged like it was the most obvious thing in the world and kept walking. It wasn't obvious to me. It was the opposite of obvious. It was a crack in something I hadn't even realized I'd believed. That crack is what I want to talk about today. Because here's the thing about growing up in the modern world. You absorb, without anyone ever explicitly telling you, a story about human progress. It goes something like this: we used to be primitive, then we got smarter, and now we're at the top. The tools get better. The knowledge accumulates. Each generation stands on the shoulders of the last one. It's a comfortable story. It puts us at the center. It makes the present feel like the culmination of everything that came before. But what happens when you find things that don't fit? Not one thing. Not an anomaly you can explain away. A pattern. A repeating, stubborn, worldwide pattern that the people in charge of explaining history have been quietly ignoring for centuries. What happens when the bridges tell a different story? Let me start somewhere most people don't look. Not Europe. Not the famous ancient wonders. Let me start in Peru. The Queshuachaca Bridge crosses the Apurimac River in the Cusco region, suspended roughly 30 meters above white water that has been eating through that canyon for longer than anyone can measure. It's made entirely of grass. Woven ichu grass, to be specific, braided into cables thick as a man's torso, stretched between stone anchors carved directly into the canyon walls. Every year, the surrounding communities come together and rebuild it from scratch. For days of work. No machinery. No engineers. No blueprints in the modern sense. Just a technique handed down through generations with a precision that makes structural engineers visibly uncomfortable when you describe it to them. The bridge holds. Of course it holds. It's held for over 500 years. Now here's what nobody explains satisfactorily. The cable tension calculations required to span that gap, at that height, over that volume of fast-moving water, are not simple mathematics. They account for sway, for seasonal variation in wind patterns, for the specific load distribution of people crossing at different speeds. The Inca engineers who designed the original didn't have differential equations. They didn't have load-bearing tables. They didn't have anything we would recognize as engineering science. But they had something. Something that produced results that modern engineers, working backward from the finished bridge, describe as remarkable. What was that something? That question followed me to Turkey. The Sendra Bridge in the Adıyaman province is credited to the Romans, roughly the 2nd century AD. It crosses the Kata stream on a single arch that spans 34 meters. One arch sandstone blocks fitted together with such precision that no binding agent was used anywhere in the primary structure. The weight distributes itself. The stones lock against each other. The arch holds because of geometry, because someone understood the exact angle at which a stone transfers force laterally rather than collapsing downward. In 1977, catastrophic flooding hit the region. The Kata stream rose to levels not recorded in the previous century. Modern irrigation infrastructure failed. A road bridge built in 1960 was destroyed. The Roman bridge, constructed approximately 1,800 years earlier, lost a small section of its decorative parapet. The parapet. The decoration. The actual structural arch untouched. I sat with a structural engineer in Ankara who had studied the bridge. He was careful with his language in the way that academics are careful when they're about to say something that makes their field look bad. He said the arch dimensions are non-trivial. That the selection of stone and the cutting angles suggest a level of material science understanding that we would not expect from the period. He said expect, not possible. He was very precise about that. I asked him what he thought the Romans knew that we don't. He smiled. He said that wasn't the right question. The right question, he told me, was whether the Romans were actually the ones who built it. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he poured more tea and changed the subject. I think about that deflection a lot. Because it happens everywhere. You ask a direct question about these structures, not a crazy question, not a conspiracy question, just a question born from the evidence directly in front of you, and the person with credentials either changes the subject or gives you an answer that doesn't actually answer anything. The egg yolk explanation is the most famous example. You've probably heard it. The Charles Bridge in Prague, one of the most structurally remarkable medieval constructions in Europe, supposedly used mortar mixed with egg yolks during construction. The story circulated for centuries as a charming historical footnote. A quirky medieval recipe. Recently, archaeologists actually tested samples from the mortar. Egg yolk content. Negligible. Traces, at most. The explanation that had been passed down as historical fact was essentially a legend. A story told to fill the gap where actual knowledge should have been. And the gap it was filling, how did medieval builders create a mortar strong enough to hold pylons driven deep into a river bottom, resistant to centuries of freeze-thaw cycles and flood pressure? That gap is still there. Still unfilled. Still quietly ignored. What was in the mortar? We don't fully know. How were those pylons sunk so deep using documented medieval technology? We don't fully know. Why does the bridge perform, hydrodynamically, in ways that modern computer modeling suggests should require a level of site analysis that didn't become standard until the 20th century? We don't know. And here's what disturbs me, nobody seems particularly bothered by that. 3 months after Turkey, I was in India. The Mughal-era bridges along the Yamuna tributaries don't get a lot of attention in the Western historical canon. They should. Some of them are extraordinary. There's a bridge near Agra, I'm deliberately not naming the exact location because I've watched too many things become tourist attractions overnight, that was built in the 1600s under the Mughal Emperor Akbar's expanded infrastructure program. It crosses a tributary that floods violently during monsoon season, sometimes rising 6 or 7 meters above its normal level in a matter of hours. The bridge has a feature that took me 3 visits to fully understand. The piers, the vertical supports, are not straight. They're angled, very slightly, upstream. The angle is so subtle you can walk past it 100 times and never consciously register it. But when the flood comes and the water mass hits those piers, the angle deflects the force laterally rather than absorbing it head-on. The bridge doesn't fight the water. It redirects it. This is not an accident. You cannot arrive at that angle through trial and error, because if you get it wrong even slightly, the bridge fails. The calculations required to determine the correct deflection angle involve understanding fluid dynamics at a level that, according to the standard historical account, Mughal bridge builders simply did not possess. I showed photographs of the pier angles to a hydraulic engineer in Delhi. She studied them for a long time. Then she pulled out her laptop and ran some numbers. Then she looked up at me with an expression that I can only describe as unsettled. She said, "Whoever designed these piers understood laminar and turbulent flow transition points in moving water." I asked her when that concept was formalized in Western science. She said, "The 19th century." She said it very quietly. By this point in my travels, I had started keeping a different kind of notebook. Not the one where I recorded dates and architecture styles and historical attributions. A second notebook. The one where I wrote down the questions that nobody could answer. The anomalies. The deflections. It was getting full. The bridge over the Danube at Regensburg, Germany, built in the 12th century, survived the 1954 flood that destroyed 3 other bridges in the city. Survived the 2002 flood, one of the worst in European recorded history. The foundation depth is, according to historical records, a mystery. The original construction documents either don't exist or have never been made public. The old Roman bridge at Salamanca in Spain, some sections dating back to the 1st century AD, is built on a foundation that extends so far into the bedrock beneath the Tormes River that modern ground-penetrating radar has been unable to find its bottom. Engineers have described the foundation as, quote, anomalously deep. The official explanation is that we simply don't have good records of Roman foundation techniques. The Khaju Bridge in Isfahan, Iran, built in 1650, functions simultaneously as a bridge, a dam, a royal pavilion, and a water control system. The sluice gate mechanism beneath the main deck can regulate the flow of the Zayanda River with enough precision to alter water pressure downstream, providing a form of hydraulic engineering that, when I described it to a water management engineer in London, prompted her to say, "That's 17th century. That's not possible. That's 20th century thinking. Not possible. Except it exists. Except you can go and stand on it. There's a pattern underneath the pattern, and it took me almost a year to see it clearly. The mainstream historical narrative doesn't just fail to explain these bridges. It actively avoids explaining them. I don't mean there's a conspiracy room somewhere full of historians deciding what to suppress. I mean something more subtle and more pervasive. I mean that when a piece of evidence doesn't fit the established narrative, the easiest thing, the professionally safe thing, is to label it an anomaly and move on. To treat the inexplicable as an exception rather than a clue. Because if you follow the clues, you end up somewhere uncomfortable. You end up having to ask, what if the timeline is wrong? Not wrong in small ways. Wrong in large ones. What if the civilizations we think were primitive possessed, in specific technical domains, knowledge that was subsequently lost? Not gradually degraded through the usual process of cultural decline, but lost rapidly. Catastrophically. In the way knowledge gets lost when the people who hold it simply disappear. There are accounts in dozens of separate cultural traditions, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Mesoamerican, of a period of catastrophic flooding on a global scale. We treat these as myths. As religion. As the ancient equivalent of just so stories. But the bridges make me wonder. What if the myths were engineering manuals? What if the people who built these structures knew the floods were coming because they had seen them before? Because their civilization had survived one, or tried to, and the knowledge encoded in stone, in arch angles and foundation depths and pier deflections that we are only now beginning to understand, was their way of making sure something survived for whoever came after. I know how that sounds. I've spent enough time in academic circles to know exactly how that sounds. But I want you to think about something. If a civilization substantially more advanced than ours had existed 5,000 years ago, advanced in the ways that matter for building things that last, advanced in materials science and hydrology and geometry, what evidence would remain? Not much. Organic materials decay. Written records burn or flood or get buried. Metal gets recycled. Wood rots. Even stone, left to itself, gets consumed by centuries of weather and vegetation and the particular human habit of cannibalizing old structures to build new ones. What would remain is what was built to remain. What was built specifically to survive the worst that water could do. The bridges. And here's the detail that I keep coming back to, the one that lodged itself in my brain somewhere in France and hasn't left. Many of these ancient bridges share a specific architectural feature. A slight widening at the base of the arches, an almost imperceptible flare in the stonework where arch meets foundation, that modern structural analysis has shown creates a specific resonance characteristic. When a large volume of water hits these foundations at high velocity, the resonance pattern distributes the kinetic energy through the stone in a way that prevents the cracking you'd normally expect. It dampens the impact without any moving parts, without any energy absorption mechanism we can identify. The stone simply diffuses the blow. To design that feature intentionally, you need to understand resonance mechanics. You need to understand the relationship between stone density, arch geometry, and the specific frequency of high-velocity water impact. This is not intuitive knowledge. This is knowledge that requires either sophisticated mathematics or thousands of years of empirical testing. Or it requires being taught by someone who already knew. I came home from my travels with a full notebook, 3 hard drives of photographs, and a very specific kind of unsettlement that I haven't been able to shake. It's not the unsettlement of discovering that something is wrong. It's worse than that. It's the unsettlement of discovering that you were never taught to ask whether something might be wrong. That the framework you absorbed, the story of progress, of accumulation, of us at the top, was so complete and so comfortable that the question simply never arose. The bridges have been sitting there the entire time. Right in front of everyone. Surviving floods that shouldn't be survivable. Demonstrating engineering principles that shouldn't have been understood. Being quietly labeled as anomalies and exceptions by people who had every professional incentive to look the other way. And every year, more floods come. And the modern bridges get repaired or replaced. And the old ones stand. The woman in France who walked her dog past the Pont Valentin had the right instinct, even if she didn't have the right framework. She shrugged because to her, the bridge surviving was simply a fact of her world. A thing that happened. Consistent, reliable, inexplicable in the way that only the most profound truths are inexplicable, not because they're mysterious, but because they're so foundational that they've stopped generating questions. But I can't shrug. I've seen too much. I've asked too many engineers who went quiet at the wrong moments. I've read too many historical records that end exactly where they should begin. So I keep asking. Because here's the final thing. The one that changed not just my understanding of bridges, but my understanding of what history is. History, as we teach it, is a story of survival. The things that lasted are the things we know. The rest is silence. And we have filled that silence with a narrative that flatters us, that positions whatever knowledge we have now as the pinnacle, the destination, the end point of a long climb from ignorance. But what if the silence isn't empty? What if it's full of exactly the things we should have been studying? The flood records go back further than the written ones. The stone goes back further than the records. And somewhere in the angles of arches and the depth of foundations and the precise, impossible geometry of structures that have no right to be standing, there is information being transmitted across time by the only medium that could carry it. Not language. Not books. Not monuments meant to impress. Just bridges. Doing their job. Carrying weight. Surviving what comes. The question isn't whether someone built them with knowledge we don't fully understand. The evidence for that is sitting in the Dordogne Valley and the Apurimac Canyon and the plains of Anatolia and along the banks of the Yamuna. The question is what we're going to do with that knowledge now that we can't unknow it. Because once you start seeing it, the bridges don't look like bridges anymore. They look like messages. Long, patient, stone-carved messages, written by people who understood something we've forgotten, and left in the one medium they knew time and water could not destroy. And every flood that passes, every modern bridge that buckles while the old ones stand, is that message being delivered again. Whether we're listening is up to us.